Welcome to Four Quarter Lives, a podcast exploring the profound impact of longer lives and careers on everything: countries, companies, couples, and careers. I'm Avivah Wittenberg-Cox, and on this week's Four Quarter Lives, I talk with Alastair Greener, a generational communication expert and author of the new Generationally Speaking: How to Bridge the Generation Gap and Communicate with Confidence. If you've ever heard a leader say, "We've got a Gen Z problem," this conversation is for you. Alastair makes a sharp distinction between age and life stage and argues we're framed by our generation, but not defined by it. We talk about why stereotypes are such an expensive management habit, what his research suggests leaders are missing, and how to unlock productivity by building genuinely intergenerational teams without turning communication into a box-ticking exercise. Welcome, Alastair Greener, to Four Quarter Lives. Delighted to have you with us.
Thank you, Avivah. Great to be here. I'm really excited to be on the podcast because it's just a subject that I love. So any opportunity to talk about it.
Well, and having just published your book, I think it's wonderful to be able to dive right in. So you make a really strong distinction, which I approve of, as you well know, between age and life stage. So why do you think so much of what we call generational conflict is probably more about people being in what I would call different quarters of life?
Yeah, but it's absolutely true, because there's so many different things that make us who we are. We live in a very absolutist world. We want everything to be black and white, to have easy solutions, and there's a multitude of reasons for that. So as a result of it, we become very binary in the way we think about certain things. Oh, you're that generation, therefore. Where actually, if we look at the life stages we get, that makes a massive impact on who we are as individuals. And of course, each generation has approached each life stage differently. So Gen Z, who are currently the emerging generation in the workplace, they're just coming in, they're graduating from university, although we should bear in mind that actually a good deal of them are the youngest Gen Zs are still only 15, so they're still only in school. But quite rightly, we're making a lot of noise about them. But don't you remember people making exactly the same noise about millennials when they came into the workplace?
Oh, yes. Oh, the amount of ink poured on millennials was equivalent, I'm sure.
Exactly. And what was interesting is that Gen Z wear the badge with pride, where millennials did not like being called millennials at the time because it was associated with many of the comments that are made about Gen Z today. And then, of course, Gen X, when they were that age, it probably was different. I do have a theory that there was a bit of a real gear shift round about the late 70s, early 80s, because boomers started having children and they brought up their children in a very different way to previous generations. So they gave them a voice. They wanted to make sure they were heard. And that, I think, had a massive impact in the way that those generations or subsequent generations were brought up and how they interacted with people.
Not always good, as we're discovering from Jonathan Haidt and his ilk telling us about our helicopter parenting habits. But we're not going to go there quite yet. Your book's mantra is very much, we are framed by our generation, not defined by it. So where do we find, I really want to look into how organizations and leaders are experiencing this generational topic. What do you feel that they most often get wrong in practice when they start throwing these generational labels around?
Very simply, they stereotype, they make assumptions. Because we, again, living in this absolutist world where we see the headlines about different generations and the labels everyone puts on them, then many organizations are making assumptions that that's what they're going to get when they interact with those generations. And that's all generations, by the way. So the challenge for organizations is to actually use all of that information about each generation as a pattern, as a guide, but not definitive. So if you can do that, and I appreciate being a manager in 2026 is harder than it's ever been before. The dynamics in the workplace is very different to the way it's been before. But if organizations make that effort, then it makes a world of difference. For example, I did some research with a company I was working with, had 100,000 employees. we discovered that if they were able to keep their employees for just 6 months longer, just 6 months, because let's be honest, the days of careers, in the same company forever have gone. So if you could just keep your employees for just 6 more months, you would make a saving of about £800,000 a year. So it's a staggering difference. So investing in understanding your workforce and understanding the individuals within your workforce is money very well spent.
So let's talk a little bit about the generational labels themselves. Like here, we've already been batting around Gen Z and millennials and X and boomers, which interestingly is something that even Pew Research in the US has said they will no longer use those terms. You're quite cautious about them. You keep reminding people you're using them, but part of the corporate world is effective because it brings in lots of people like us to talk about these generations. Where's the line? How should companies be more cautious about
I think that the line is very blurred, if the truth be known. In my research, I interviewed in 2024 4,000 people to see how they like to communicate across 6 generations, across all socioeconomic groups. But then I just had an epiphany. I came up with this idea, well, why don't I put that, use AI to compare it with what the perceived view of every generation is. And a bit of a spoiler alert, because it's in the last chapter of my book, but it turns out we're on average, about 65% stereotypical. Now, that's not scientific, but what it is a great indication that actually 35% of us are not going to be the stereotype that maybe someone assumes that we are. And I think that's really important for organizations to understand. So yes, those patterns are really useful. It's a really good starting point, but it's not the end game. And I think for organizations to actually dig a little bit deeper, then they're going to find some extraordinary insights into their staff. And remember, especially with newer generations, they are used to being listened to. They want that feedback. The other thing we found in my research was that most younger generations want more feedback than they're getting.
Yeah.
The problem that organizations do is then they do a one-size-fits-all. Yeah. They say, yes, you know what, Alastair, you're quite right. We're going to up our game. We're going to give people more feedback. What happens then is your Gen Xers and your boomers at the other end say, no, I don't want all of that stuff. So, yes, it is.
And I don't want to give it.
Yeah, well, that's true. But what it means, though, is that we just have to be a bit more bespoke in our approach to management. It's really interesting. Right now, in 2026, the youngest millennials have just turned 30. And what that means is that actually the millennials in the workforce are the driving force, because they're the ones in HR, they're the ones in middle management, again, without making sweeping statements. But predominantly, it will be that generation in those positions who, by the way, are experiencing that stage of life in a very different way to their parents, especially women whose role within the workplace has transformed in those 30 years.
Oh, indeed it has. Thank goodness. I always, your word of bespoke is very relevant. I'm always a bit surprised that companies don't do more original research in their own laboratories of talent that they've got on tap and go to this sort of more stereotypical public research about things that are inevitably going to be different. So let me dig down into one of the most striking moments I found in your research was realizing that only 6% of the HR leaders you surveyed reported overt generational friction, but almost 2/3 said better intergenerational communication would boost productivity. So what's that gap telling you?
Well, you know what? It was quite stark. It was the first bit of my research that I did back in 2023. And I was actually hoping it would show more friction, which would then enable me to say, hey, you need me. So
every consultant's dream, I know.
Exactly. So my initial response was actually disappointment. But then when I dug deeper and found that 2/3 figure, I suddenly realized, my goodness me, we've got a problem here. Because what it said to me is that you recognize that we need better intergenerational communication, but actually you don't take it seriously enough because you don't see it as a major friction point. So I see that as a warning sign for organizations to say, hey, you need to be doing things. And I think the biggest thing, that one of the assumptions that organizations are making is attrition rates are higher, engagement rates are lower. You only have to look at the Gallup engagement survey every year to see how rock bottom low it is. And they're blaming it on a generational viewpoint. That's the way they are.
For decades. I mean, the engagement scores are extraordinarily depressingly low across the
Exactly.
It's like, 84% are disengaged.
It's shocking. And yet, if they just spent that little bit more time, I used a figure earlier on, a bit more time, really working with their teams, engaging. One of the things that I offer my clients, the big corporates, is that we do the same survey that I did for my book for their organization to find out how their people want to communicate. Because survey after survey after survey, when organizations find engagement's low, they do a survey to find out what's happening. It's always about communication. It always comes up top.
Yep. So let's talk a little bit about one cohort in companies that feels a little invisible. And you probably represent them, Alastair, the Q3 people in their 50s and 60s. What are HR leaders really saying about this group when you talk to them, maybe behind closed doors? Are we stereotyping, or is there a growing recognition of their potential role?
You know what? There's a very mixed picture, mixed picture. And the sad part is, and it's not something particularly new, when you have people in middle management roles who are in their 30s and 40s, they look at people older than them and think, maybe it's time for them to go. They make the mistake that they're not, interested in technology. They're not interested in developing and moving ahead and so on. And we're seeing, and you know this as well with your research, that people are staying longer in the workplace than they ever have before. In fact, I was looking at a statistic recently talking about the amount of people who are still in work over 65, and it's massive. And increasing. And increasing, absolutely. And there's a multitude of reasons, whether it be financial, but a lot of it is actually worth. And one of the mistakes I think organizations make is that they look at older people and think, okay, well, we'll keep Bob there or Janet there for a little while longer, but, they're kind of on their way out. And then that sets a whole sort of pack of cards folding, because then they feel disengaged because the attitude towards them is like that. So it really sets off a bad course of action, where I do agree there are some people who are in work who've been there way too long who actually need to go and find something that they feel passionate about. There's no question about that. We know those kind of disruptors in the workplace, and organizations do need to find them. But don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's a huge amount of people who really want to give, they want purpose, they want to feel valued. And isn't it interesting? Gen X in particular are probably one of the most creative, innovative, and sort of dynamic generations, because they've overseen a massive technological change. One of the things that I found in my research that, far from nobody over 60 being first adopters, there were first adopters there. There were early adopters of technology. I remember my father, who died, almost 20 years ago. He loved computers. He was in his 80s and he loved them.
The internet generation, par excellence, right?
And you know what's lovely is the fact that the tablet, of course, was a game changer for older people. All of a sudden, there weren't wires and cables and all sorts of things to get confused about. My mother, who's 86, has just gone onto WhatsApp. She loves it now. Now she knows how to use it. So this whole thing of that they're not inclined to learn new things is one of the big errors I think a lot of organizations do. And certainly a lot of those millennial, dare I say, in their 30s and early 40s have that view of
or managing people. The IT departments.
Yeah. And the fact is, a little bit of time. Yes, you might have to give them a little bit more time because, of course, when you're in your 50s and 60s, you've developed habits over a long period of time, and habits take a while to change. That doesn't mean they're not prepared to do it. It's just we need to give them that time and understand where they're coming from to then help and assist.
Well, and I also find this whole Q3 group either is written off entirely. 50 plus is just kind of nudged out the door as too expensive and too tech phobic. Or it's seen the opposite, and it's the crucial people who earn all the money and make all the decisions. But there's a tremendous amount of diversity in this group. I mean, they're not all any one thing. Have you seen, or I've only seen a few organizations get much more granular and sophisticated about starting to segment their Q3 population the way they often do their Q2 population, whether, by the way, we're talking talent or customers. Have you seen any good examples of more subtle and nuanced segmentation of this older group beyond, no, they want to keep learning, or, nah, they're just too...
I haven't seen any specific data that says exactly, where people fit.
Yeah.
But the one thing that I would absolutely cite is this whole thing of creating multi-generational teams within the workplace and the value of that. And of course, the huge piece of research on this was done by BMW back in 2014, which became the subject of a Harvard Business Review, which I'm sure you're familiar with, where they created these multi-generational teams and productivity went up by 8%. When you have that kind of statistic out there to say, listen, there's real value to your organization to mix up your teams. And of course, the big topic today isn't this, some people call it reverse mentoring. The better term is mutual mentoring, where you mix those teams up and then you find the experience. And to lose all of that experience in Western culture, we're mad. You go to Asia and they see older people as the sages of society. Yeah, where here we can't wait to put them into some form of nursing establishment.
Yeah.
By using that incredible experience, organizations have a huge amount to gain. Now, don't get me wrong, those people at that upper end do need to be open to new ideas. They do need to listen. They can't be dissing Gen Z. They have to have a certain mentality towards it. But actually, I think organizations will be surprised how many more people have that if they are welcomed into the fold than don't.
Yeah, I mean, this notion that I totally agree with of becoming much more intentionally intergenerational in the way you design teams is something that's emerging. I think you might agree. It's not quite, it's quite a leadership or management capability that I think many don't have. And you argue in becoming more literate at this generational difference stuff, you should look for patterns rather than pigeonholes, I think was your term. How should leaders balance this? Hold those patterns lightly, get to know them better without slipping into the stereotypes? Do they have to just get more serious about doing in-house research and getting good data? Or is it something more of a skill to build?
I was working with Deloitte recently, and they have what they call a manual of me. And it's an amazing piece of work where when they set up new teams, everyone produces their manual of me so that they all understand each other, how they like to communicate, how they like to do things. And one of the challenges I think a lot of organizations do is they over-process their communication. And it winds up becoming sort of transactional. It winds up becoming something that isn't really real. And we all want to have that connection with people. And I find one of the things that's quite interesting is that when something goes wrong with their communication, the big organizations, corporate, often in the public sector too, something goes wrong, and rather than dealing with it, they put another process in on top. And then another one on top of that. And the thing becomes so clunky. A classic example, I was working with a client recently and they hadn't settled my invoice. So I just sent them a quick email saying, hey, would you mind having a look at this? And this is absolutely true. And I'm not going to say who it was, but I got this email back with an attached PDF PowerPoint presentation, 17 pages talking about my payment journey.
Boy.
Now, exactly, when you get that kind of processing, you wonder why people are disengaged with what you're doing. So I think it is a case of stripping back. It is enabling managers to have the time to get to know their teams. And, and it starts, by the way, with Gen Z and everybody, the moment, actually, even before they walk through the door and begin their first week, the recruitment has to match the onboarding experience. And one of the biggest challenges, especially with Gen Z, if they don't match, they're going to decide within a week whether they stay or not. And the chances are they won't, because they want transparency, they want clarity. So making sure that the recruitment is completely transparent and honest and truthful and accurate. And then that's matched by a really strong onboarding process in that first week, which is tailor-made to the individual. That might sound like a lot of work, but remember, if you can keep people for just 6 more months, it's going to pay off.
I find a lot of corporate requests coming in on anything related to the generational issue is still very often, come and help us with Gen Z.
Yes.
We've got a Gen Z problem and it's driving everybody crazy. Do you find that as well? And why is that so limiting, especially in a world of longer working lives and this expanding Q3 population?
You know what? It's a big mistake. And I one of the first things I do is I say to anybody who brings me and says, we need help with the Gen Z, I said, okay, let me talk to your C-suite first, because it always starts from the top. And, as soon as you cultivate an attitude of it's all their fault. Yeah. And here's a couple of reality checks. They're not going away. Gen Z are here to stay. The attitudes are here to stay. And also, although it's changing, we are getting a slightly more tightening labour market at the moment here in the UK. But even so, if you've got talent, you've got ability, and you've got some experience, actually, there's huge demand for you. And therefore, if you're not looking after them, they'll go somewhere else. And they can still do that, especially in tech sector. In a lot of sectors, that's really true. I appreciate not in all of them. But spending that time and understanding your culture, have you got a generationally inclusive culture in your organization? Or are you just looking at blame? Because the reality is that, that there's 3 elements, as I always say. There's the generational side, there's the life stage side, but there's also the socio and technological evolution of society. The whole of society's changed. And what Gen Z are doing today, we're going to be doing tomorrow. Remember the days when everyone said, oh, terrible, isn't it? Kids on their phones all the time. You just eyes on the screens. You go to a restaurant these days and you'll see people in their Q3 sat opposite each other on their phones. So we're now doing it. So I'm afraid to say, for those people who seem to think it's all Gen Z's fault, I'm afraid, yes, Gen Z have got some learning to do. They need to be molded. They need to be prepared. They need to be helped into the workplace. And there's a joint level of collaboration that should be taking place. But blame has never helped anybody. In fact, my next book is going to be about blame and the fact of how futile that is.
Oh, we do love a scapegoat for our problems, don't we? When you go into the C-suites and you want to help them unlock more value from their second half talent, what are 2 or 3 concrete things companies should start doing differently, like now or tomorrow? And do you still see a pretty dominant attitude of, well, Q3, you're on that nice slope out and we should accompany you?
I think the good thing is it's becoming less so, actually, because what's happening is millennials are seeing their own parents and realizing their own parents have still got something to offer. They're still doing things. And when they make the comparison of their parents and then their grandparents when they were that age, thinking, wow, that's quite a big difference. So there's an element where actually they're fairly open to it. But here's some key strategies I think they can do. The first one is what I call omni-channel communication. You cannot just communicate by email or, I work with organizations to say, yeah, no, you're absolutely right. We need to go more digital because we need to include Gen Z. Yeah, but don't scrap everything else. Again, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Yep. I appreciate it's harder, but you need to be communicating on multiple channels. In the mornings, I now have to check my LinkedIn, my WhatsApp, my texts, my emails. There's a lot of...
It's exhausting.
No, it is exhausting. But you know what? It is what it is. So, I often think that my theme tune should be Get Over It, because there's a great band called OK Go who made that song. I'd love to use it because part of me says, you know what, it is what it is. So we need to adapt. So the first thing is you communicate across all channels, not just one single channel. Yep. Then I've talked about it already. Tangle your teams. So bring in those different generations into your teams. And sure, you will soon discover if people aren't fitting, if it's not working. And that's the point you'll find if there are some Q3 people and Q4 people, and they're not open to evolution, development and progress, then that's the point. Then, you need to have a conversation. But actually, you'll be amazed how open that they are given the opportunity.
Okay. So go omni-channel on your comms, tangle up your teams generationally. And what was the third one? I lost it.
Actually, the third one I didn't say, but actually I'd go back to what I said before, is about the onboarding and recruitment.
Yeah.
When you're bringing people in, one of the things, I was talking to somebody yesterday and she runs a social media business and she said, I've got all these young people. And she said, I found something really, really weird. She said, they do want to be told. They want to be led. They don't want to be just led freestyle. They do want guidance and help, but it's just in a different form. So the reality is, yes, we do need to set the lines. We do need to let people know what the expectations are. But if that conversation is at the very beginning, it's not such a difficult conversation. So it's a real difficult
bring
conversation.
Back a bit more middle management is what you're suggesting. Yeah. Like help people.
If that conversation takes place after 6 months and someone says, well, you haven't said anything before, why now? And that's a really valid point. So that relationship that managers have with their teams is more important than it's ever been.
I've heard in a number of, particularly professional services firms, these kind of pretty resentful Gen Xers who are working between what they see as two entirely different generational cultures and histories. The boomers who had it all good, could delegate everything, kept, just the partner role, went out and rain made, but basically expected their teams to grind out 24/7, and they did. And then these millennials and Gen Z who, work-life balance, don't want to work all the time, have a very, very different attitude to work and its position in their lives. And these people in the middle who have to navigate those two sets of expectations and feel that they're the compensating generation in between that kind of has to pick up all the crap from both ends. What do you tell them? Would you agree with their interpretation?
It's really interesting. I think this is a half glass full or empty scenario because Gen X, in many respects, did have it all. And, I was reminded when I was in the corporate world, I remember someone coming to me and saying, you know what, I'm fed up. This isn't like it was in the old days. It was always better then. And, I came up with a phrase that I've used ever since. I said, remember, today is someone's good old days. We have a wonderful nostalgic viewpoint of the past, which isn't always accurate. We know it's far from accurate. Gen X, of course, there were elements which were really tough for them, but there were elements that were better for them. They had free university education with grants. They had, opportunity to buy houses younger. This is all the things that their young people younger than them are complaining about. So we'll always have something to complain about in terms of, we're caught between they had it all, they've got nothing, all those kind of things. And, the reality is, A, it's not going to change. And B, it's what you make of it and how you deal with it. I do worry a little bit about this work-life balance that younger generations are seeking because they look at older generations, they look at the wealth they've gathered, and they put it all down to the way that the system was, where actually they worked very hard beyond, as you said, beyond the hours, but then they saved and were able to create a certain amount of wealth. And I think that is going to be a challenge in the future because that wealth isn't going to be stored up. There's a great book, Inheritocracy, where some people are going to be relying upon that. So I do have some concerns there, but I also think that, stop blaming everybody. Stop blaming them for having it all and them for having life too easy. We're where we're at. Let's make the most of who we are, what we've got, and invest in others, whether they're older or younger than us.
Yeah, I know. It's hard, isn't it, for the young, because success looks so easy once you've got it, but the 30 or 40 years it took you to get there is completely invisible to them. So,
and when you look at the amount of people who left school at 16 and worked, back when I was a youngster, when I was at school, those who went into the sixth form was literally, there was about, I don't know what it was, it was probably about 10, 15, 20% went to sixth form.
Yeah.
The majority left, went to work, went to technical colleges, did other things.
Yeah.
And they were contributing to the system very early on, where now, and through no fault of their own, Gen Z are thinking they're going to have to get masters to be able to get the decent jobs, which means they're now in their 23, 24 by the time they're actually now in the workplace. So there's quite a lot going on here and a lot to unpack. And again, one of the things I deliberately try not to do is to be judgmental, because it's not anybody's fault. Yeah. It is just the way it is. No one intentionally messed up another generation.
You may not want to be judgmental, Alastair. Everybody else wants to be. Now, you came out of the corporate world. You're a good example, right? You came out of the corporate world to work for yourself because of flexibility and control over pace, like many Q3ers. How does that choice reflect what so many of us are quietly trying to redesign for themselves? And how do you think, or do you think the corporate world is positioned to compete with that choice or even respond to it?
You know what? I think for number one, I think it's a wonderful thing to be able to do. And I do appreciate it's a privilege for many people to be able to do that. But I also think it's a life stage thing. You get to your 50s and you suddenly think, hang on a second, is this my last hurrah? Have I got anything else in me? And your whole view of purpose of life, I think, changes. You know, if you're empty nesting, you suddenly have just a focus back on you and your life partner or whoever else is around you. Plus, of course, we are seeing people slightly older than us still working. So you suddenly realize, actually, there are opportunities to keep on going. So it's a wonderful thing to be able to do. And if you're an organization and someone comes to you looking for work, wow, how brilliant. They're doing it because they want to be there. They're doing it because they've got purpose. I appreciate some are doing it because of the financial elements of it. But a lot of people are changing career, changing direction in that Q3 period because they want a different purpose in their lives. And what a wonderful thing to capture. Isn't that great to be able to say, wow, I've got someone who really wants to be here for the intrinsic reason of being here. And if you don't pick up on that, are you missing out on a trick.
Yep, absolutely. It's a huge workforce. So to conclude, Alastair, as I ask many of my guests, is to take on my 4-quarter life lens and describe in a word or a phrase your own quarters so far. And what would you like out of your next quarter, the 4th one, when you get there?
As I said before, I'm incredibly fortunate. I hate the word lucky because I think we create our futures in so many respects, but I'm incredibly fortunate that I'm able to make choices about my future. I'm very excited about it. I intend carrying on working into my 80s if I can, because I found something that I love and I enjoy. And I really hope that other people do. And if you are someone who's in that 3rd quarter and you're not happy, please just go and find something that's going to get you excited and get you buzzed, because life is way too short not to. So my mantra is go for it, enjoy it. And if you're, that oldest cliche, isn't it? If you enjoy your job, it's not really a job. And if people can find that, not only will it be incredibly fulfilling for them, but it's also incredibly fulfilling for society as a whole and for organizations. So I'm really excited about the future. I think and I'm an optimist as well, as you can probably tell. I can see the challenges. I'm not naive, but I think that we will see through. And I think that we do have an optimistic and a positive future ahead of us.
Well, and it sounds like you've got a few more books in you. So you mentioned the next one. How many more are you already got in your brain that you're planning?
Well, funny enough, I never really set out to be an author. It sort of just happened. And a lot of it started really just because I wanted some really good, solid data for what I was talking about. I wanted to feel that confidence that I knew what I was talking about. And I thought if I set out the data myself, I'll do it. So that was the first book, which came out in November last year. The next book I'm going to be starting, I've got a very busy year at the moment. So it's going to be towards the end of the year, I'm going to start on the next one. But then the exciting thing I'm going to be doing is in 3 years' time, all the data I collected in 2023 and 2024, I'm going to repeat revisit it 5 years later. And then we're going to have a new edition of the book. And the one thing coming back perfectly, going full circle, we will then really see the difference of life stages, because Gen X will be in a different place. Gen Alpha will have just emerged into the workforce. And again, it's very arbitrary, these figures. It's not just there's a hard line and all of a sudden there's going to be a difference. But we're going to see a real shift in patterns. And I'm really excited to see in a few years' time what that looks like. So it's the book. The next edition will be a snapshot in time of then, but then comparing to the data that I've got in 2023 and 24. So, I've got a lot of work to do, but I'm really excited to see what that happens. And if it just helps people understand each other a little bit more and make us a little bit less judgmental, then I've done a reasonable job.
Give us, maybe just to close, a little sneak preview. What are we expecting of Gen Alpha?
To be quite honest, we don't know. The big thing that we're going to see is they are going to be the AI generation. They are going to be the generation who grow up with AI and assume it's there. And, things like talking to your smart device in your kitchen or whatever. I don't want to send everybody's off in a hurry now. They're going to be a lot more interactive with that. They're going to be more tech savvy. One of the great things I think about Gen Alpha, certainly the younger ones, which is great, their attitudes towards social media are going to be quite different, because their parents now understand the challenges of social media, and therefore they will be framed in a different world. And that's where my positivity comes out. So
we're going to learn from our mistakes, you mean?
Yeah. There's a lot there. And we are always behind the curve. We invent the technology, then work out how to deal with it. Yep. But I think they're going to be a very exciting generation.
Alastair Greener, thanks so much for being with me, talking generationally. I look forward to your next publications, and I will put the links to this one, Generationally Speaking, in the show notes. I'm sure many people will want to pick it up. It's fascinating. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've really enjoyed it.
Until next time, 5 years hence, I think. What this conversation makes clear is that generational tension is rarely about age. It's about where we are in our lives and whether organizations are willing to design for that reality. As working lives lengthen, the real risk isn't difference, it's laziness. Defaulting to labels instead of paying attention, blaming cohorts instead of building capability, and sidelining experience just when it becomes most valuable. If this episode nudged you to rethink how you lead, or how you're led, or how you want your own next quarter to look, then it served its purpose. I'm Avivah Wittenberg-Cox, and these are our 4-quarter lives. Thanks for listening. For more thinking about the impact of our 4-quarter lives, you can read my column at Forbes and subscribe to my Elderberries newsletter on Substack. Let's design lives that aren't just longer, but better.